Today, I'd like to talk about an alternative interpretation of historical events. I'm specifically going to be focusing on the era of time between the development of the first atomic bomb to the present day, and I'm going to talk about how, indeed, there was a chain reaction that occurred as a result of the development of the first nuclear weapon. It's a chain reaction that resulted in the decimation of humanity's chance at survival. And worse yet, it's something that has already played out and we just don't know it yet. Now, on this channel, we like to talk about topics that are spiritual or that are based on the debate between science and religion in some interesting ways. Now, this is very germane to that topic, and by the end of the video, I think you'll see how relevant this video is to discussions of spirituality in general. The main motivation for this video is the fact that the movie Oppenheimer, which was a really great movie if you haven't seen it, I found it to be very moving. I thought the actor portrayals were very compelling. It's now out on digital media. And this prompted me to reconsider something that I've previously talked about a lot with many members of my own generation who saw this movie. Oppenheimer in some ways asks a similar question, but what we're going to do is consider the question in a very new light and consider a very novel scenario, and I think it's important to talk about. All right, so this is a video where talking about my perspective is probably important to communicating some of the points that I'm going to make. So I want you to know that this is from the perspective of somebody who did grow up in the era of the nuclear weapon. So this is the perspective of someone who grew up in an age where the world's fate was thought to likely be decided mostly by an anticipated Third World War, which would be fought with nuclear weapons. I do want to make a mild spoiler warning. Most of what I'm going to talk about is historical events. If you haven't seen the movie Oppenheimer, some of the things that I'm going to talk about are things that are depicted in the movie. If you already know the history behind the movie, then it's unlikely that there will be any kind of spoiler from this video. But if you haven't seen the movie and you want to go in totally with a blind or clean slate, here's your spoiler warning to turn back now. It is a great movie, again, that I recommend checking out if you haven't seen it yet. If you haven't seen the movie, it focuses on Robert Oppenheimer, who's best known, although he had a lot of great ideas and his impact was felt through a lot of the physical sciences, but he's mostly known for being the lead scientist who created the first nuclear weapon. There are two important conversations that happen in the movie, and by the way, it's a great movie if you haven't seen it, and I do recommend checking it out. But there are two important moments that we're going to focus on just briefly. The first moment is a conversation between Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein. So in preparation for detonation of the first nuclear weapon, the first test detonation that ever occurred, Robert Oppenheimer went to Albert Einstein and asked a specific question about whether or not his nuclear detonation would wipe out all life on Earth. So it was postulated at the time that perhaps the nuclear detonation would result in an ignition of the entirety of the Earth's atmosphere and set off a chain reaction that would turn the entire Earth into a ball of flame. So that was the first conversation that was a real historical conversation between Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein. The second conversation is depicted in the movie, and I'm not sure that this is based on an actual historical observation, but Robert Oppenheimer goes back to Albert Einstein at the end of the movie and asks a question in a very poignant way, which is, what if, by creating the first nuclear weapon, indeed there was a chain reaction that resulted in the destruction of humanity? But this time, the implication of his question is that in creating the first nuclear weapon, he has essentially taken the first step in a massive, massive arms race that would culminate in a world war that would be fought with nuclear weapons that would end humanity. All right, now back to the history of this issue, and again, this largely relies on my own perspective as somebody who grew up in the era of nuclear weapons. Most people in the generation before me and in my generation will agree that seeing the first nuclear detonation, the first detonation of an atomic weapon, was such a striking and overwhelming image that it was ingrained in all of our minds. In fact, it was something that we all talked about. It became part of the common lexicon, not just in the United States and Canada, but also everywhere around the world. So talking about mushroom clouds, talking about nuclear weapons was something that was so common that you talked about it on around every water cooler. There was probably somebody in every country who was talking about nuclear weapons. It was talked about at every dinner table, and it was a very, very commonly discussed theme. In particular, we all talked about what would happen if more nuclear weapons were detonated, and how a world war fought with nuclear weapons would end humanity. And this was a time of extreme existential angst. We saw mushroom clouds and nuclear detonations on our televisions, on our in our movies. We saw it on the news, and and over and over again, we were shown images of nuclear weapons detonating, resulting in mushroom clouds and resulting in massive, massive casualties. We were shown images showing the devastation of our cities and what our cities would look like in the ensuing firestorm and in the nuclear winter afterwards. We were shown images of our neighborhoods being totally destroyed. And we were shown images of our homes burning and our entire way of life being absolutely devastated. At the height of the Cold War, and this is why this was such a realistic and such a powerful fear, at the height of the Cold War, there were over 60,000 nuclear weapons. Right now, there are 12,512 nuclear warheads the last time I looked it up. But 60,000 nuclear weapons is enough to destroy the entire world and permanently end humankind hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times over. So the nuclear cache that the world was in possession of was massive and was capable of destroying humanity, and even igniting a small percentage of all nuclear weapons around the world would probably permanently end human life. And here's how we dealt with that fear. We did drills. Even as little kids, we were told that it was likely that there would be a third world war. This is a time where our teachers, some of whom had lived through two world wars, were giving us this introduction. So we were told that there would be global devastation. We were told about this from a very young age, and we went through drills where we hid under desks. Mind you, I remember very clearly my teacher telling me when we were doing these drills that this would likely not help us, that the devastation from a nuclear war, and a global nuclear war especially, would be inescapable. There would be no way to avoid it. So even though we did these drills, it did not in any way abate the existential angst that we all felt in facing down the possibility, and indeed the likelihood, of nuclear Armageddon. So I think growing up in this backdrop, in anticipation of a global nuclear war, really created a massive amount of existential angst, and in some ways even some psychological and emotional trauma, and certainly some changes in the perspective. But then, after decades of an escalating Cold War and being brought to the brink of nuclear destruction, in the summer of 1989, the unthinkable happened. And what happened was the fall of communism. That was mostly culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the breakup of the USSR was a massive change for the world that was the ending of the Cold War. And after several nuclear crises that occurred throughout a decades-long Cold War, this was finally the moment that I think there was essentially a global and generational sigh of relief, because we were pulled back from the brink of nuclear chaos. For many countries, this was a time of great joyousness, and I think a lot of communities celebrated the collapse of communism, the fall of the USSR, and an increase in national and local patriotism in some really positive ways. And it was definitely a transition for generations from the Eastern Bloc that were then growing up in a new way of expecting and experiencing the world. But the question that we asked in the United States was, why wasn't this the happy ending that it should have been? This should have been a time of joyousness. And instead, for a lot of reasons, it turned into a very anticlimactic experience for our entire generation. So let's look at the reasons why it was turned from a moment of joy to a moment of anticlimax. So the culmination and the ending of the Cold War had several effects, and I try not to have too many word slides, but I think there are a few important things to focus on and things that are changes that were really fundamental in our mindset during this era. So the first thing is Generation Jones, which again is the kind of the tail end of the baby boomers, and Generation X were all raised with a very foreshortened sense of the future. That phrase is something that commonly gets used in the study of chronic PTSD, but a foreshortened sense of the future just means that when you're raised in a time of crisis, it makes it difficult to foresee the long-term future without seeing devastation. So it's hard to look past things that are very threatening, things that threaten a lot of death, and things that threaten a lot of devastation. The other thing that happened is I think we felt like there was a pathway to Armageddon that we had successfully veered away from. So I think we felt as a collective, as a generation, that the story of the destruction of the globe was largely over. Now, there were a lot of other things that were happening at the same time. We were entering, as part of those generations that occurred after the baby boom, a depressed economy, and in some ways a lifetime of letdown promises. For example, we were the generation that missed out on knowing powerful and eloquent and charismatic leaders like John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. We missed out on the achievements of the civil rights movement. We missed out on Woodstock. We missed out on the Summer of Love. Instead, we were born into an era of cynicism about political change, especially after Watergate happened. There were other things that were happening economically at the same time. For instance, there was a massive shift in the employment fields away from manufacturing and towards service industries. So we stopped building things. And in addition, there was massively high unemployment as this transition was occurring. There was another important factor that I think was really critical, which is the baby boomer generation was largely a generation that all owned their own homes. But Generation Jones essentially started with a massive uptick in interest rates, which shot up to 12%. So that meant that the people in Generation Jones and the people in Generation X were not able to buy their own homes, came out of high school and college with a very depressed economic outlook, and were leaving this very anticlimactic period in a march towards a future that was very uncertain. So that brings me back to my own individual perspective. And I remember very elegantly feeling like at the end of the Cold War, there was a period of economic and financial and political and social uncertainty. There were really positive things that had happened that we missed out on. And as a generation, we were wondering what our legacy would be as a generation that had grown up with a childhood of a foreshortened sense of future and a sense of dread for the future, certainly, and also with a lot of economic, political, and social realities that were very stark. So the age of the nuclear weapon had come and gone. We watched the world being brought to the brink of destruction and then being brought back, and our own existential crisis had come, it had gone, and we felt that it had been resolved. So the crisis, in many ways, we felt like was sort of averted at that point. But then, after that, the next crisis came, and when it hit a generation that had been left skeptical, disempowered, and in the wake of the greatest anticlimax in history. And that next crisis came in terms of the recognition that happened in the late 80s and early 90s that human behavior was destroying the environment, and that if left unchecked, human industrialization would leave the entire Earth uninhabitable. It was only in the early 90s that we began to first appreciate, as a civilization, that we were entering into a period of massive extinction, and that the mass extinction that was occurring had been created by human behavior. I do think that there was another trend that happened during this time period, which is maybe a topic for another video. But I do think the science fiction of that era, mapping out the human genome, creating nuclear weapons, creating nuclear fission as a furnace for energy, these were all things that were amazing scientific achievements, but there was a sense and a promise of endless scientific advancement, both in our truth, our reality, and our fiction. So I think that promise of endless scientific achievement is something that did lead us to feel like we were in a time where things were starting to plateau. We had come off a period of great scientific achievements, great scientific discoveries, and the next few decades, I think, will be remembered as a time of a bit of stagnation. Now, there's some very interesting scientific literature that's currently coming out about whether or not science has an end, whether or not it will have an end, and that is maybe a topic for another video. But I think the promise in truth and in fiction about scientific discovery being endless was something that did leave our generation a little bit disillusioned and hoping for more than what we received. There's a band called We Were Promised Jetpacks that nicely recapitulates some of what I'm talking about here. And as a result of the fact that we ignored the next crisis, the environmental crisis, things on the planet have gotten worse. The world is 1.2 degrees hotter than it was when I was in high school. Every day, 150 species, each and every day, go extinct. Since 1970, 60% of all land animals have been wiped out. Between now and 2050, 10% of all life on Earth, animal life and plant life, will be lost. By the year 2100, that's projected to be 27%. So now we return to the original query that Oppenheimer posed. Did he set off a chain reaction that destroyed humanity? I think in some ways the nuclear age did something that profoundly was mind-altering psychologically, emotionally, and societally. And I think growing up with that sense of impending and inevitable nuclear holocaust as the end of humanity is something that made us less capable to deal with the next crisis that we faced, which was the environmental crisis. Now, this is not an excuse. So I hope if people watch this video that they consider it a bit of an apology from somebody who's in Generation Jones / Generation X. We saw the writing on the wall. We had a chance to address the oncoming environmental crisis, and we failed to act. This is maybe one of the biggest generational failures in human history, and it's certainly the biggest signpost that has been ignored in human history. So we were really preoccupied with averting a nuclear holocaust, and we failed to, at the same time, look at the real reasons why the things we were doing were destroying the Earth. And I think that's something that is perhaps was caused by growing up with an era of nuclear weapons. All right, so that sort of brings this video to a close. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why we wanted to talk about this scenario in this video. First of all, it's something that's personally moving for me, but also this YouTube channel deals a lot with spiritual questions and religious questions, and I think this is something that I don't see much, or certainly enough of, in the debate of science versus religion. But I think the biggest failure of religion in this day and age, the biggest failure that all religious institutions share in, is that they all knew about climate change and they failed to make it a spiritual and moral imperative. Climate change is maybe one of the biggest moral crises in human history, and yet religious institutions have done nothing to address that moral crisis. I think that will be remembered throughout history as a major failure, not only of my generation, but also of religious traditions around the world. There were times that we could have averted this catastrophe, and um, the religious institutions should have really rallied to make it a more important moral and spiritual cause. I really want to thank you all for supporting this channel and checking out this video. I always want to encourage people at the end of these videos to be kind in your conversations and humble in your conclusions. We talk about a lot of big spiritual questions here, so nothing we're saying in this video is meant to be the definitive truth about the way things are. We just want to spark conversation, and we want to do it in a way that's kind. I'm really grateful that some people have given me some really positive feedback on some of the previous videos that we've posted. So I would really love it if you commented on this video. I would love to know what part of what generation you're in as you're watching this video. I'd love to know how you feel like the nuclear age affected your generation specifically. I'd love to hear from people who are in the later generations about what sense of doom you had growing up in an era where there was still some fear over a nuclear holocaust and a third world war. So I'd really like to know your thoughts on all those questions. And I'd love to know if you have a sense of continued trauma or dread as you look to the future. We would love it if you like this video. I'd love it if you put some comments on what you think of this video, particularly since this is a new channel. Your likes, your comments, clicking the bell for notifications, and subscribing to the channel are really, really significantly impactful for our channel and the success it has going forward. If there are other topics you'd like to hear us talk about, please put those in the comments section as well, and we'd love to hear about that. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks for watching this video, and sorry to end on a bit of a grim note, but I would love to know your thoughts, and we'll keep the conversation going, and we'll be posting some other new content really, really soon. Thanks everyone for the support.